This is the Cardiff Business School podcast, where we explore the power of public value in everything that we do. My name is Peter Wells, and I am the Pro Dean of Public Value here in Cardiff Business School. Today, my guest, I'm really pleased to say, is Professor Martin Kitchener. Martin, welcome.
Hello.
You're a Professor of Public Sector Management and Policy, but perhaps we need to backtrack a bit.
Mm-hmm.
And we're here to talk about public value and the role of public value in the school and what we try to achieve with that. And I think it's fair to say that you were heavily involved in that whole process of establishing the idea of public value. So in that case, it'd be great to start with just why? Where did this come from? What moment was it that kind of lit a light bulb in your mind that said, yes, this is going to be a great way of organising what we do and why we do it?
So I think there was a moment when the light bulb might have come on in my head, but I think a long time before that, distinctively but not uniquely in our school, as you know, it had a very strong tradition of doing work that contributed to the common good, to the public value. And it was almost a distinguishing feature of our school, almost from its inception. Unlike many other schools, we'd had people across all of our sections doing work that was addressing grand challenges, before they were called grand challenges.
Indeed, yes.
And doing it in a inter or multidisciplinary way, perhaps before that term was invented or came into more common usage. I guess this part of the story can go back to about 2012 when I became head of school, or dean as it's called. And my first job that was given to me by my line manager was to invent a strategy for the school.
Okay.
The normal approach to that, and the approach that's taken in most business schools, is to concentrate on producing relatively short-term, what I call outputs. That's increasing the salary of our graduates. It's about getting accreditations and rankings. It's about getting research income in and getting high-quality publications that are judged by certain kind of league tables and what have you. So it's all about getting these things, what I call instrumental outputs.
Right. Easily measurable metrics.
Easily measurable metrics, because that makes it easy for managers to do it.
Right.
Yeah? Which is quite convenient if that's the way you want to spend your time as someone running an organisation. And given there's about 14,000 business schools in the world, the vast majority of them work like that and have those kind of strategies about measuring things and then measuring the things that individual academics do.
Right.
And so I'd been around in business schools for long enough to know that was the standard approach. And I could have had possibly a relatively easy life if I'd seen my time out as dean,
doing that.
Setting some targets and then measuring people against these targets.
Yes. And that was the expectation, you think, from...
I think that's what was expected, and it would be a reasonable expectation because that's what most business schools do.
Yes.
So why wouldn't Kitchener do that?
Yes, why wouldn't Kitchener do that?
Well, Kitchener wouldn't do that for two main reasons. Firstly, I don't think that is an effective way of running an organisation, and it's not necessarily my belief, given that I'd spent about 25 years doing research.
Yeah, and this is a really important point, I think, which we have to emphasise. You have a strong research background in understanding organisations.
Well, yeah, there is that. And doing that had led me to become aware of research evidence and also have done my own studies of organisations, which suggests that that kind of approach to strategising, strategic work, running organisations, doesn't deliver the best outcomes in the longer term for organisations. And it also leaves unexplored the potential for organisations to do things in a more innovative way or in a way that delivers a range of outputs that are more addressed to longer term concerns. And
also possibly even more rewarding for staff.
And the whole way of rethinking that might lead to a more rewarding experience for staff and our students and our other stakeholders. So leaving aside my kind of first reaction, which is always to be a bit lazy and do something simple. Yeah,
I find that hard to believe, Martin, but we'll brush over that.
Yeah, I thought about that for about 5 seconds, and I thought, well, we've got an opportunity to do something a little bit different here. And that opportunity wouldn't have been as apparent in all business schools, but because Cardiff Business School had got this tradition, and this very strong tradition of being a very broad church, covering a wide range of disciplines, from accounting and economics and logistics, and organisation and marketing, all that. We've got all of these folks doing lots of good work that had been motivated by an attempt to make things better over the longer term, that we had the possibility of then drawing on that to develop a slightly different strategic approach to how we ran the school. And I started thinking about that.
Interesting. You had to bring people with you. Was that a kind of hearts and minds discussion? As you say, there was a groundswell, an underpinning of support anyway for this direction of travel. But at the same time, you clearly needed your fellow managers in the school and you needed somehow to persuade the rest of the university that this was an approach worth taking and important. So how did you deal with those?
There was possibly a step that it's useful to understand before that, in that I was quite clear about what I didn't want to do.
Okay.
I didn't want to do what every other business or most other business schools did. Yeah. But when I started, I didn't have a clear idea of what I did want to do.
Okay.
Right.
That's interesting.
I was quite open about that. And I discussed this with my line manager and said, it's going to take me some time to work out what it is that I think we need to do. I know what we don't need to do. And I'm going to need to have chats with lots of people, and I'm going to need to do some reading. And first of all, I looked for inspiration in the general management literature, the stuff we teach. Yeah. Right. Didn't find much inspiration there.
Not a surprise.
Which is kind of worrying, because we hope that our students will be inspired by that work. But I didn't find anything that I thought was inspiring for me or suitable for our school. So I started looking a little bit beyond our own discipline.
Can I just backtrack briefly there? And by that time, we'd been through that kind of financial crisis around 2008-09, and there had already begun an element of reflection on, what is the purpose of business schools? Are we culpable in creating the kind of people that triggered that crisis? And yet you still didn't find...
That was interesting, because there is, as you rightly say, there's a whole set of writings about business schools. And at that stage of its development, around 2010, 11, 12, most of that work was criticisms of business schools. There was a recognition that what was going on and how they were being run could be improved, but that debate had not gone beyond the criticisms to actually exploring alternatives. Yeah? More people than me were aware that we needed to look for some alternatives, but those alternatives hadn't been conceived. So there was no template that I could find for this alternative way. One other institution in the UK, they tried to take a more critical approach to management and teach that. That didn't work in the longer term, but at least it was a suggestion that there were alternatives. You just need to find them. A willingness
to explore.
In some places, there was a willingness. At that time, some people were beginning to think, we need to do something different with business schools, and there was an idea that some people would need to have a try at doing that. So I went to the low-hanging fruit, or the easy, perhaps, sources of inspiration, and didn't get anywhere with that. And it was completely by chance, a conversation with a colleague of ours, Rick Delbridge, who had just read a piece by a leading sociologist, previous head of the British Sociological Association, John Brewer, who works at Queen's. And he'd recognised that there was a bigger problem within the social sciences more generally, and that social science wasn't maximising its potential benefit to the world, and that a number of things were limiting social science in its development. One was that people tend to stick with their own within their own disciplines, whether that's sociology or management or psychology, and that too much of it was research that was driven by the need to publish in top journals. And it wasn't addressing things like climate change or poverty or all of the what we call grand challenges. So John Brewer wrote a manifesto for a new type of public social science. And he actually used the term public value there. So whereas most people's first entry into thinking about public value is through the work of public management scholars like Mark Moore.
Yes, of course.
My entry through it was through a sociologist who had been thinking about, he wasn't necessarily interested in business schools at all. He was interested in sociology and other social, but he'd developed an idea that we needed to take our disciplines, think about them in slightly different ways, reorient them to addressing proper big-scale problems, and do it in an interdisciplinary way. And he framed that or presented that in a manifesto for a social science that delivered and was oriented towards delivering public value. And Rick brought this work to my attention, and I said to Rick, what would a public value business school look like? And it went from there. That was 2012.
Okay. And of course, we've covered, within this podcast series even, we've covered a lot of the kind of fruits of that initial discussion.
Yeah.
And it's fair to say it's sort of lifted the lid to some regard in terms of allowing people to do things that they are strongly motivated by. And what's interesting about it is that, for me at least, it means that they can take those core skills, which they still have, those discipline skills, those techniques, those ways of working, those understandings that they've got, and they can then, yes, they can write the journal articles. Most of the people that sit here across the table from me have done exactly that, as you have done, but equally take it into the world and make a difference.
Yeah.
Now, in your case, what's been interesting to me is that, of course, you've passed the mantle on to some extent to other deans, and the world has moved on. You have also moved on, I think, intellectually in terms of how you regard all of this. But I see two things going in parallel, and I wanted to ask you about it. One was this journey from public value to organizations with a purpose.
Yes.
And the other was how your work has become more local in character. And I wondered if those two things meshed.
Again, I'm not going to spin you a story about how I was 8 years old and I decided I wanted to become a dean of the first public value business school and had all of this planned out. There's an awful lot of serendipity. There's an awful lot of chance. There's an awful lot of randomness in this whole story. But to try and make it perhaps even a bit more coherent than it actually really was, during my time working with colleagues to kind of develop this idea within the school, that was over 6 years until about 2018. It was all quite specific to Cardiff Business School. Yeah? So we decided that public value was a nice way of encapsulating what we stood for and what we were trying to do. And it was very specific to Cardiff. I don't think that idea of being the public value business school would have worked at every business school in the UK.
Clearly not.
As we mentioned before, there's stuff about Cardiff, and there's something about the political and economic context of Wales that makes it very appropriate as well. It fits with the Future Generations Act and the kind of the more social democratic traditions in Wales than in other parts of the UK. So it kind of worked in the context. When I finished being dean in 2016-17, I was lucky enough to have a sabbatical year at the University of Oxford.
Oh, yes.
And the idea was you go and recharge your batteries and have a think and how you're going to reintegrate back into polite society after being a nasty manager for a while. Yeah? So that's the idea.
You're still a work in progress on that.
It's a journey, Pete. It's a journey. So that was the idea. And I went, as you know, for a sabbatical year, you produce a plan of what you're supposed to do. And then I didn't do any of that, as usual. What I did do was had a chance encounter with an academic at Oxford who had previously been the dean of the business school at Oxford University. Okay. And he's an accounting academic.
Okay.
Very different
world.
Different view of the world to me. But he had just been working on a project with the British Academy where he'd been re-envisaging the role of the corporation. And he'd developed this line of work about purpose-driven corporations. And very interestingly, he'd done a historical analysis of the history of the corporation. Right. And he found that for the vast majority of history, all the way back to antiquity, corporations had essentially been purpose-driven. And it is only since the late 60s, 70s, 80s that profit or profit maximization had become the purpose, or become thought of in terms of purpose. So rather than thinking it's the default position for organisations to have instrumental outcomes or profit as their driving force, this is a historical blip. Right? And business schools obviously have got a shorter history than the corporation as an entity. when I then started going back through the history of business schools, if you look at some of the early some of the early North American ones, they were founded with a very strong sense of purpose, right? That wasn't about producing articles and increasing. It's about professionalising management and giving them a sense of ethical,
a rounded management,
a
as
more
well.
rounded approach to management. So that began me thinking about, is public value in Cardiff really an articulation of purpose? Yeah? And then what is the purpose of the business school in general?
Right.
That allowed me a way of thinking more broadly about organisational purpose, and I got into that. And so that's where my own kind of research is at the moment, thinking about organisational purpose.
And this is, I think, an interesting kind of progression. I mean, it shows you that kind of core ideas can continue to develop. But I noticed in one of your more recent outputs, you talked about the precarious nature of this.
Yeah.
And I think in the current setting, as we've seen what's happening in the US, and we've seen the pressures that are bearing on the UK university sector, how enduring can this sort of approach be given those very precarious situations?
Well, as with most things, the ideas aren't really mine, right? So, or indeed necessarily Mayer's. There's a very strong history in organisational scholarship of people who've looked at purpose, and you go back to the foundational work of Philip Selznick, Tennessee Valley or whatever, and one of his insights or learnings about organisational purpose is that it's fragile or precarious. Right. Yeah? And so you can have an organisation that is oriented to a certain kind of social purpose, but it's that strategy, if you like, is fragile in two ways. It's fragile from external forces that might seek to disrupt it or co-opt it or alter it in some way, but also to internal disruption within the organisation. So people who
When you say internal, what does that mean?
Well, the fact that you can do things that you hope will work out in a certain way, and then through unintended consequences, they actually develop in a way that actually subvert your original intention. Because life is not linear and easy; it's messy and complicated because we're dealing with people and all of this. So, right from the start, I was aware of the fact that in the head of an organisational leader, like a business school dean, you can have this idea of purpose and all these, and then it's really not going to work out like that. And not everyone is going to see the world in the way you do.
Of course.
And some people inadvertently, through their actions, will knock it off course or shape it in a way. But that's a potential source of innovation, and we'll talk about that. But also there are some people outside who may deliberately or in a more malicious way seek to change the course. So this notion of precarity or fragility of purpose, I think, is a really important lesson for anyone thinking about trying to do stuff in organisations in that way.
Well, indeed, and I think we somewhat feel it now, to be honest. We've seen, obviously, the school here, like many other schools and many other universities, there are these enormous pressures, and we're seeing a high rate of change. I think one of the interesting aspects from my perspective has been how coherent the culture has remained under those pressures, which is in a way quite encouraging. It shows you that we still have the quite deep embedding of some of those values. But this point of innovation is perhaps something to kind of round up on. I mean, I was struck by, when I've been supporting things like the engagement fellowships, it's been really interesting to see people pop up with all sorts of random ideas about things they'd like to do, yourself included.
No more random than that.
Well, I'm hoping it's going well. But it's lifting the lid again. It's this idea that rather than control, you try to release.
Well, this was another feature, if you like, and this was intended, right? I think we'll own it, if not take the credit for it, that in terms of our approach to leading or coordinating the organisation, from the outset, we were clear that we didn't want to go down the instrumental outcomes route, and neither did we want to follow what was another very strong tendency in certainly public sector leadership at the time, which was to set KPIs, key performance indicators, and see that as the primary approach to strategy. You set people targets, you measure them, and all the rest of it. Our approach, and Rick and I have subsequently written about this, is that we're couching it as an approach to strategy that is oblique, right? That doesn't mean it's random. It doesn't mean it's chaotic. But the role of organisational leadership in this view is to set a general direction of travel. In this school, we're going to try and orientate our work to addressing grand challenges, and we're going to work in a multi or interdisciplinary way. You folks don't need me, right, to set you targets and whatever. Yeah? We've given you like a canvas. You're the bright people. Yeah, you know your disciplines. You know what the challenges are. You go and knock yourselves out and do that. Yeah, you don't need us telling you to do it. So that's why that approach, we would argue, to strategies. Recognising the innovative potential and capacity of colleagues. They just need pointing in a direction, and off you go and work it out. So most of the things that have happened in the school, the public value podcasts, that wasn't dreamed up by the dean, or someone in the senior exec, a little closed office. It was a bright colleague who saw a potential for innovation in generally the right direction.
Right.
And that's happened across the school in terms of developments in teaching, developments in individual research agendas. It's about allowing people to find their own way towards achieving a strategy, rather than being very prescriptive and setting strict, kind of KPIs, which through my own research and research of others, I don't think is an effective way of running an organisation. And it stifles innovation, if nothing else.
Yes. Which is surely our core activity.
You'd think, wouldn't you? Yeah. But you set someone a KPI, they might work towards achieving that KPI, but that doesn't necessarily mean they'll do it in an innovative way.
Or be particularly happy doing it.
Or have happy colleagues or students around it. So this is a very different approach to strategizing. It involves a very different role for people in leadership roles. Yeah? They're not spending their time behind desks on Excel spreadsheets, monitoring, counting beans, right? They're out there trying to inspire folks to say, right, this is where we're going. How can you think about your teaching differently? Let's have a chat about it. Yeah. It's a different way of couching, strategic work and the role of leaders in organisations.
Yeah, and I guess
it involves a recognition that we don't know the answers.
No,
that there are other people out there who are much better placed to innovate. They've all had extended periods of training, all had lots of experience. Unleash it. Yeah. We don't know all the answers.
And I guess we'll see now in the next few years how well that has become established in the school. And you and I can watch from the sidelines and see how it works out.
Well,
and what can I say? Thank you very much, Martin. It's been absolute whirlwind pleasure. I was going to ask you about triathlons, but we haven't got time. I wanted to know how that fitted in this story, but another day we will follow that up. Thank you very much.
Okay, cheers.
This has been the Cardiff Business School podcast, where today we've been talking with Professor Martin Kitchener, one of the inspirational thought leaders in the area of public value and the wider question of organisations for a purpose. It's been a tremendous discussion. It's been eye-opening, and I think it's been inspiring us for future work as well as thinking about how we've got to the point at which we've reached today.